presenting some ideas? You have some ideas you want to present, Raidul, today? Or
Yeah, I have some
yeah,
slides to share with
okay,
you.
okay. I mean, I will talk more than I'll present slides, but I just want to share what I'm thinking. I'll also give an update from the Lawrence Berkeley group briefly. But I'm pleased that Alison and I should be able to craft something for the ACEEE meeting next year, session. That'll be nice. It's not guaranteed. I mean, we would just submit a proposal for one of the afternoon sessions, but I don't see why we wouldn't get accepted. So we have to think of people we'd like to invite to be on those panels. So I can send out a draft to the whole group as to what we're thinking and invite people to suggest names.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being a little more interactive too.
Yeah.
I don't know where she is.
Okay,
So I'm just going to start. I think you should just go ahead and start.
Yeah, let's start. How many? So is it just myself and Raidul? Tammy, are you going to separately or
I wanted. Oh, here's Allison. Yeah, I wanted to go last because I think you're going to present and Allison's going to present, and then I'm going to present things that I think should be in your paper that I'm willing to contribute.
Okay. Okay.
I think it's better context.
Okay. So shall I start then? And then Raidul and then Tammy. Allison, you there?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Allison.
Hi. Sorry about messing up.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, Allison. I should have made sure you had the link, and I just didn't even think about it.
No, I should have known.
It's fine. It's fine. We're just chatting. So the idea was that we, Allison, you, myself, and Raidul present ideas for the products that we're thinking of developing in terms of a review. In our case, it's also tied to developing models, but we wanted to just make sure that we have carved out separate products, and to the extent there's overlap, we explicitly decide we want to share information or collaborate on these products, so we can make that clear now. Then we can move forward, since we really need to start producing stuff. And Tammy has ideas for what she wants to contribute, but based on what we present, she'll decide where it should go. That's the idea. So I was going to start, maybe Raidul next, and then Allison, and then Tammy. Is that okay? So very quick update. I don't know how much you know about this, Allison, but as I've been doing this model review, literature review, on what are the drivers of technology adoption in households, what do we understand from the literature, I found out that the DOE had commissioned a very similar paper from a couple of authors in Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and they shared a draft with me that was done for EVs and rooftop PVs when they were just about to embark on heat pumps. And so I thought, why do these things in parallel? Let's collaborate. It turned out in the conversation that they just wanted me to provide what I had because they hadn't started on the heat pumps and they had a deadline. And I was a little bit circumspect, but I said, okay. And he looks like what they want simply is a summary for the US, for literature in the US on what has been shown to be the determinants of or barriers to adoption of heat pumps. So it's like just a compilation of the influential variables. And they want to do some kind of presentation of basic models and what they do, but I don't want to contribute to that. I told them we want to do our own paper. So I'm going to suggest that a couple of sentences there that just actually cite to a future paper that we write instead of actually writing anything substantive. That's what I want to propose to them. Something that we, one of these 3 papers that we are producing, have them just cite to that. So I would write basically a couple of paragraphs based on a set of papers that have been written for the US on, which is not many, like I can count them all on one hand. Okay, so that's an aside, and now I just want to share some ideas which are very, very raw about what a review paper might cover. Can you see my screen? So what I'm thinking about is a little more of a methodological study, not a study to document the findings of the studies. The idea is to write a review article that looks at the approaches in the literature to uncover and model barriers to heating system change. So the first thing is, in terms of the scope, I was thinking about was not just heat pumps and not all kinds of home energy improvements, but heating systems. Because heating systems share certain characteristics in terms of providing comfort, and they're being assessed against each other. So to whatever extent we understand drivers of heating systems, and specifically change. So I'm very interested in studies that have tried to look at change in the technology of fuel, I guess. And so I was motivated a lot by this one paper that's an excellent review, in my view. It's very recent as well. In 2022 by Chadwick et al. It's in ERSS, Energy Research Social Science. That's a review of household technology adoption, broadly speaking. So it includes heating system, rooftop PV, energy efficiency, all of them. And it's very comprehensive, very well written, and provides kind of a meta-analysis of the broad categories of influential variables, cognitive, economic, affective, context, etc. It creates this kind of a taxonomy and discusses rejection as much as adoption, and talks about sort of the limitations in literature really looking at rejection. I liked that, and I want to use that as kind of a launching pad. And I'm seeing that there's been a reliance on a lot of sort of bespoke surveys. A lot of studies will do a survey based on a specific hypothesis or a specific type of variable they want to test out, like a peer effect or psychological, the theory of planned behavior, agency, the people that have a sense of lack of control or a sense of control and how that affects their decision, things like that. And then you'll have a survey that's done specifically to tease out that variable. And so they are in some ways really hypothesis testing, although they don't explicitly say so. But it turns out that in the literature, the more types of influences you include, the better your goodness of fit in a way. And so that speaks to trying to have a comprehensive representation of decision variables or factors. So I was thinking of looking across the studies for heating system technology change and seeing if through some kind of meta-analysis I can construct what would be such a comprehensive utility function that includes economic variables, theory of planned behavior type variables, so attitudes and towards agency, attitudes towards the environment, and then their effects as three categories of variables. And explore through the review what combinations have been tested, with what frequency and with what result. And specifically focus on rejection determinants to the extent that has been explored. So this is the review component of it. The idea is to understand what model of decision-making is behind these papers, how have they tried to tease out the factors that influence adoption or change. And then here's the thing I was hoping to do that was a little bit constructive, which was to, and here again, I'm very raw. I'm just thinking aloud. I want to construct a hypothetical model that starts with the traditional payback function and representative agent. So it's something that's what's used in the traditional models in the US. And usually they have some like constraint on the share of households that would even consider this decision. And that's what I think is a big limitation. So to surmount that limitation, in the next stage, I would add a trigger function. So it's just the first stage decision about whether or not to consider changing equipment at all. And I would use the results from Christina's work, as well as potentially just age distribution of the equipment and using just various cutoffs based on what we understand to be the age when people switch equipment out, vary that parameter and just look at how that changes the share of households that even consider the first payback function. And then in the third stage, so stage one is just economics, stage two is trigger function plus economics, and third stage is add a couple of these weighted components, the neighborhood effect, and some representation of the psychological variables from the literature. Because that's usually how the ABMs represent them, as a weighted function of these three types of variables. And I don't know if I'll really be able to come up with any numerical values for these. It depends on what I find in the survey and the review. Otherwise, I think for neighborhood effect, I think there's enough to create proxies. It won't be a very strong effect except in the South and the Middle Atlantic. Anyway, so the idea was to construct a toy model that would build on these, build up these various factors, but using real data, using the American Housing Survey, the idea being that it's a nationally representative survey. Unlike almost every study that's been done so far, that's always a little case study. So that's the strength of it. And seeing whether broadening the set of variables one considers in the decisions, using variables that have been in some sense verified or validated in past literature, and see whether that adds explanatory value with using the AHS to our prediction in the US. And just as a last note, comfort well-being to me is entirely missing from this literature. I don't really know what to say about that, honestly, in terms of the modeling work. So that's where I am. I'm totally open to, if this is ending up overlapping significantly, to joining forces or to taking critical feedback on it. This is very open, but I do feel there's a need for something like this that's not just looking at influential variables. It's trying to think about how we approach modeling. How do we approach prediction? And are we doing it the right way, and what's missing? And specifically focusing on rejection rather than just early adopters. I think there's a big bias on early adopters in the literature. So that's where I am so far.
Soma, can I ask, I think it's like the modeling component, and Rachel may talk about this more, but it seems a little bit unusual to have a modeling component in a review, because usually it's just like a review and then the model is, well, I don't know. I guess there's modeling papers that have lit reviews, and then there's reviews, but they don't typically they don't typically embed. And this is what would happen if you use the results of my review. And so how are you seeing this?
Yeah, the thing is, I'm not convinced with the LBNL review paper and the Chadwick review paper that was done in 2022. I mean, there's been a few very recent reviews of this work, broadly speaking, of what are the factors driving adoption. I don't think there's value to just doing a review that's just focusing a little bit more on what the models have done. I don't think that'll add enough value to me.
Okay.
But what I was thinking of was, I'm pretty sure that there's not a single one of these studies that has a fully representative survey behind it. And one that doesn't start out with a hypothesis that they're trying to test. So the idea was, if we were to take the literature as a whole and take it for granted that certain variables are important, but we don't know if they are generalizable.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to simply do is take a survey that we know is generalizable, that is representative, and I guess I'm making the assumption that I'll be able to have enough variables in it to represent the factors that have been found to be influential. And see, it's like testing it out in the US. Do we feel that these factors actually add explanatory power to predicting ownership, to predicting adoption? Because right now, we really have no basis to claim any realism in adoption. So it's like I'm testing out what the literature says about what drives adoption on a nationally representative survey to see what it says. So it's not exactly a review paper. It's a critique of, yeah, I'm not sure how to position this. What I want it to be is a critique of modeling approaches and how the extent to which they rely on valid empirical findings, and using a toy model and demonstrating its application to a representative survey to say something about the validity of those findings in the US. And I don't know what it's going to say until I, put these variables in, use these proxies. Of course, it will depend a lot on the validity of those choices. But I just am not convinced that, on the one hand, just do a review piece. And I'm also not convinced that we have enough data to do just a new generation model based on empirically valid findings. I don't think we have enough of a basis for it. So I don't, I'm trying to, with this kind of a paper, provide recommendations for how to move forward to develop such models better. Yeah,
Okay.
not perfectly satisfactory, but at least my motivation hopefully is clear.
So is Raidul next? Because I think he might be most relevant to this. I don't know. What do you think, Narasimha? How do you want to do this?
I think that sounds good. If there are no clarification questions, we should move on and aim for 10 minutes, Raidul, and then we can move to Alison.
Yeah, sure. So what I have been doing so far with this review paper in mind, I was mostly focusing on how ABM is being used. So Narasimha has more broad topics, like he's looking into different modeling techniques, but I was mostly looking into the ABM characterization of the interaction between influential actors. And I'm mostly looking for the heat pump adoption process, but we can certainly extrapolate on that and capture the whole heating system process as well. So what I was thinking or have been doing so far is trying to understand, in line with what the Respect project goal and vision is, that what are some of the influential actors in this domain who will be involved in the decision-making process. So some of the agents that are actors we have been thinking so far is the occupant, building, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, yeah. So energy, organization, contractor, and if there are any other agents we have missed so far, and what those literature is thinking about in those influential actors. So, and the discussion for each of those agents will consider about like what is the spatial and temporal scale of the study site. Is it for like 30-year study looking into the future? What is the projection scale? When they think about a spatial scale, is it just about a specific area or just the whole USA, something like that? Or if in Europe, if this is just a different few villages or something like that. I am also thinking of looking from the volume of agents perspective. So in case of modeling techniques, it's also very important to look how many agents we are considering. Sometimes people just mostly focus on graph-based representation, like network representation, or sometimes people just look at this number of occupants, large number of occupants. The more data availability we have, the more accurate we can represent the decision-making process. I was also looking into information about different data set, like some of the literature mostly use synthetic data set, some used survey data set, some used like real world data set like the we have for the Karthik's contribution, and what is the analysis here. So based on all those factors considered, I was playing with this kind of model or table to include in the review paper. So my idea is that when we think from the agent perspective and we have, okay, this paper have included information from this kind of household, from the building perspective, they have included this information. What are some of the things that this particular paper is not looking at? Why are they lacking in? And I'm pretty sure that there will be, once the table is filled out, there will be a generalization that most of the papers are missing on 2 or 3 agents, which comes as a barrier for the modeling perspective that we are not being truly representative of the real world scenario or the decision-making process. So with that, I was thinking of coming up with a recommendation that we need to consider the influences from these different actors at the same time so as to have more realistic representation of the decision-making process. And that's where our recommendation from the time model will come up in the end. That's mostly I have considered so far.
So just as a clarification, Raidul, from what you read, have you seen? I mean, one of the ABMs that I've seen, it's almost always exclusively focused on the occupants in terms of
Yes.
agents,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit on buildings. So do you know of studies that you've looked at that actually have government like policy modeled as an agent or contractors?
I haven't seen anything from the contractor, but there are some ABM model specifically looking into government policies.
But is the policy just an exogenous input, or you actually have an agent that has behavior?
Most of them have focused on just a different policy process, but there are 1 or 2 paper, I think, that have mostly focused on government regulation. That was their main point of interest.
Mm-hmm.
So question, Raidul, I think Narasimha was saying that in certain aspects, he doesn't really think another review of certain things is going to be useful or novel. Is that correct, Narasimha?
If the focus is on what are the drivers of adoption, then no. But I think maybe Raidul is thinking about ABMs in particular, where the focus is not necessarily on teasing out drivers of adoption. It's on seeing how particular drivers play out in terms of the impact on adoption or the emergent property idea of ABMs. So that I think is valid and useful. I'm just concerned that your focus on, okay, what agents are represented is not going to be much there. And this idea of, what are they including in the ABM? How did they derive it? That part overlaps, in the question, in the research question that I'm asking. But I think it is possible to write a paper along the lines of what Rye and Robinson did earlier, which is more generic for what's good practices for an ABM, right? And doing a new version of that for heat pumps in particular, considering this particular domain and considering new papers that have been done since that paper. That is 2015. So I can see value for an ABM focused paper. But yeah, I think you have to do, we have to talk a little bit more about what the objective is.
Yeah, so I was thinking just more, it's not that it has to be a ABM focused paper. I was just doing the literature based on this notion, but we can certainly mold that to be more broad. As I've said, that your research question is more broad, like you are considering the whole heating system and also all different types of modeling techniques. So when I was doing this for other modeling paper, I was mostly focused on the ABM, but we can certainly extrapolate on that and consider other techniques as well. to answer the more broad questions.
So if I could, Narsim, I'm not sure based on your comments. We've been assuming this is a section of your paper, so I'm not, like, your concerns about overlap. Of course, they're supposed to overlap, but I also feel like your paper has now changed in scope from the last time we saw it. So,
So I misunderstood. I thought that Rydal, we're talking about something that Rydal wants to lead as a separate review
No.
product.
no, there's not a review product from Rydul. So he had already done this review of ABMs, and I think the last time I was really aware of your paper, it was a review of modeling approaches, and ABMs was a subset. And so we were thinking that Rydul would write that subset and that you would then not have to.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, really, although the formulation seems to be broader in that it's heating systems, and different modeling approaches, really the only ones that try to incorporate any kind of behavioral aspects are ABMs. So the bulk of the literature that I'm talking about actually are ABMs, but there are a few ABMs that are not heat pumps, not many, they're mostly in Europe. And there are a few papers that don't do ABMs, that it's more traditional type of model. But they don't really make an effort to really try to tease out behavioral characteristics. So I don't think there's that much dissonance as maybe came across. I actually didn't realize that you were thinking of a component to the same paper, the same product.
What we had talked about before break was that, so it's good to get this structure straight now, right? What we had talked about before break was that Rydul was not not writing a new review, contributing to yours, but then there would be a separate paper that got into reviewing, or that got into, like, what are the implications, or how does this play out using an ABM. So then that's why I was a little bit confused about you including that modeling component in the review, because I thought that the review and then the demonstration was going to be two separate things.
Yeah.
I think we should move on to Ellison, because I think it's good that we've identified this. And then I'll take a very short, I hope, bit to say what I hope to see in your papers. So yeah, let's do Ellison now.
I think you're muted, Alison, or can't
I
hear
don't
you.
think.
No,
Can
it's
you hear
good.
me
It's good.
now?
Yes.
Okay. So I prepared two slides, one describing the product that I've been working on, and the second one with objectives. And then I have a Word document I've been building out that includes some prospective or candidate tables or figures. So I think the best way to describe what I have put the most time into to this point is quasi-systematic review. I'm calling it quasi in part because some of the more stringent protocols around systematic reviews, I'm not adhering to those. And I don't think that's a deficit to what this paper could offer. But it is more like a systematic review than it is a scoping or mapping review, at least to this point. And what I've been working on is constraining what galaxy in the literature this would be focused on. And so these are some bullet points that I've added to specify the kind of studies that would be included in a systematic review. Maybe before I get to those, I didn't prepare a motivation slide. The work that I wanted to contribute to this project has been motivated by my experience doing work in what I term field-based studies. It's generally are studies that are community-based or community engaged or have some element to it that involve engagement with people in their homes. I would consider them small scale, usually less than 100, but I think we could say less than 1,000, depending on certain types of studies. And I have encountered over the last decade or so the inclusion of well-being measures when people are in homes with the people that live there. And the motivation to include those well-being measures is varied, sometimes more grounded than others, and has even informed some of the questions that are included in the semi-structured interview that Chris is developing. But there is a lack of guidance on what to include in residential environments if we're interested in measuring well-being, and yet there are people that are out there measuring well-being. And what I think has come to light as a meaningful gap to fill would be to document what has been measured, what kind of measure that is, how does that map onto existing frameworks around well-being, and then potentially identifying measures that are over or underrepresented in these kinds of studies. So I think there's a critical piece to this that is defining what context the guidance would be for. And so I think what I tried to put some thought into here are sharing what I think the field-based studies mean to me, because field-based can mean lots of different things. It can mean, you know, surveys deployed to tens of thousands of people potentially, and that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm really thinking about individual researchers who have been doing work in residential environments, who have expanded beyond outcomes like physical health and mental health and are now more interested in understanding the well-being impacts of an intervention or the associations of features of the home, such as a household energy system, with well-being. And yet the implementation of well-being measures has been a bit haphazard. And like you were saying, Narasimha, it's often very bespoke, but it's sort of made up within the research team. It's not necessarily grounded in other conceptual frameworks around well-being. So the goal of this work would be to identify the studies that qualify for the systematic review, document what well-being measures have been implemented, filter those through a taxonomy, and I don't really have that here, of well-being measures. Tammy and I have talked about needs, satisfiers, indicators as being 3 different types of measures, and then show what the distribution of well-being measures that have been conducted in studies like these is over that taxonomy, and then further map the well-being measures that have been done in studies like these onto frameworks that intend to represent many aspects of well-being. So what that would look like, similar maybe to what Rachel presented, a first table would be a list of features and characteristics of field-based studies that were considered for the review, with an emphasis on what the study setting was, who the study population was, what kind of home environment and home energy system or home energy system is represented, what was the primary purpose of a well-being measure, what was measured, and this could be multiple measures, but it's just meant to be representative. How was that measure assessed? So like if the well-being measure was indoor environmental quality, did they measure PM2.5? Did they measure temperature? Did they measure, did they ask people what their thermal comfort level was based on ASHRAE questions? So the measure and how it's assessed are 2 separate things. And then any framework that they use to identify that measure. And I expect in many studies, there won't be one identified. So this would document, this would probably not go in the main paper, it's be an appendix, but what has been measured, and then we would take those measures and how it was assessed and map it onto a taxonomy of measures as well as aspects of well-being. And I've, used this framework here, but Tammy and I've talked about how this isn't the only one that, that we would rely on, but I don't want to make up a new well-being framework for this paper. I want to choose among several maybe and say, how does what's done in the field map onto these frameworks, if at all. I think there'll be some cases where there are things that are measured that don't map very well to any aspect of these frameworks. And I think the outcome is this final objective here: to assess the extent to which field-based representations and measures of well-being in the context of the home environment are over or underrepresented to date, with the intent to provide guidance for future research. I'll stop there.
And we've talked about having Zara contribute to this review by classifying some of the papers.
Yeah, Zara and I would conduct the review together and extract the information on well-being measures and how they are assessed. And then also bin those into categories based on a taxonomy of measures and maybe some frameworks that divide well-being measures up in different ways.
I think this sounds great and valuable. I'm just trying to understand the scope. If you draw a boundary around, because what, imagine if you were doing a keyword search, right, to systematic keyword search to identify the articles that will be covered by this review.
Yeah.
Can you give me a sense for what those keywords would be? Are they all studies that are trying to, field work? This is field-based studies. So are they trying to characterize well-being? Is that part of their objective?
Yeah, so this is as far as I've gotten on that. I think it will prove to be far too broad at this point. I think some things that I've even added in this previous slide that I think will be, I guess this is an iterative process, so maybe we'll have to go back and revise again and again, but I think adding common terms now, like community engaged and community-based participatory research, I don't actually want to be so hyper focused on those types of studies, because I think I feel like those are just a trend in how we talk about research right now that won't endure. It will be replaced with something else. And community-based and community engaged work was done well before those terms were coined. But I think it gets at the audience that I would like to be focused on. I don't see myself being able to lead something that's all that useful to people that do modeling or people that do larger scale survey-based research. But I do think there's a growing number of research groups that do work in people's homes and lives and have wanted to tack on well-being as something that they, generally encounter now more often, or like, oh, I should slap that onto my study. And I don't think that they're poorly intentioned, but I think there's not a place to look for guidance on that. Whereas if you went into people's homes, here's the analogy. If you were a researcher that's never studied air quality, but you wanted to measure indoor air quality in people's homes, there's actually a decent amount of guidance out there for how to measure it, when to measure it, what to measure with. And I would actually believe, if I were a reviewer of a proposal, if somebody said, I've never done these measurements, but here's the guidance I'm going to use, I think they could conduct a solid set of measurements of indoor air quality. I don't think the same sort of guidance exists for introducing well-being measures into studies like those. And this wouldn't be the final word on that from this paper, but I think it would be moving in the direction of if you're considering adding these kinds of measures to your study, what are some guiding principles to follow? So maybe to get back to your question there, Simon, I think we might find some studies that are focused on patterns and predictors of well-being in people living in manufactured housing, for instance, but that would be very rare. What I think is more common, at least to the audience I have in mind for this product, is we're measuring environmental justice issues around indoor air quality, and we're also going to measure something about well-being. We're going to add that in, or we're assessing an intervention or a natural experiment, like a road that's being moved or a road that's going in, and then we're also going to ask some questions about well-being. That's really more the kind of study type that I'm thinking about.
And you want them to be more systematic and rigorous about what they are doing when they characterize well-being. And so you want to assess what they are picking up, what they are trying to measure, placing it in the context of the actual theoretical constructs, and then coming up with some insights for the future for how you should do those studies if you were to do them in the future and actually try to assess well-being. That's correct? Is that?
Yes, I think that's very accurate.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking because there's so many dimensions of well-being. So these are not ands here, right? Like, for example, it's not that you have to have a link to household energy systems, right? It's an or. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And there probably needs to be some nots, like in the Boolean logic thinking.
Yeah.
There needs to be some not this, not that.
So there's a whole bunch of literature on energy poverty, which is just in the sense of energy burdens or, mold or whatever, broken equipment that affects even mental health and things like that. Those would also be part of your scope.
Yes, potentially. And Tammy brought this up yesterday when we were talking. The limited encounters I guess I've had with energy poverty literature, it's very vast. Or maybe not very vast, but it feels like it will be important to draw some clear boundaries about what is included and what's not. That's why I have gone back and forth on the potential trade-offs of really gearing this towards a more domestic audience versus a global. And I feel more capable of achieving this if it were domestically focused. It might draw from maybe the way that people have in other countries have drawn boundaries within the frameworks around well-being or taxonomy of well-being measures, but it wouldn't include studies that are field-based in, say, Vienna-based housing.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's, to me right now, there's a set of trade-offs associated with that restriction.
I think it's great. I mean, my only feedback is that I'm wondering if this ends up becoming just too, you have 1 million articles. And one way to bound it is if you decide to focus on certain dimensions of well-being in that taxonomy that really focus on the things you're interested in, and that'll help you bound it. But I think this sounds like it's really useful, and yeah. So we have less than 10 minutes. Let's first hear from Tammy. And can people go over past 11 or no?
For me, just a little bit.
Yeah, I can go over a little bit, but not a lot.
And maybe we should plan to end at 11:05. So let Tammy, you go, and then we'll just talk about next steps because we need further discussions on all of this.
Yep. Okay. So, and I think it might be useful to maybe, well, I won't talk about next steps. You can talk about next steps. Okay. So I have additions to or suggestions for both papers suggested by Ellison and Narasimha. And so I'm calling these the well-being elephant, like as in the blind men and the elephant, because they're all talking about the same thing. And Narasimha's is the secret longitudinal, like we assume that we can predict sort of what happens longitudinally, but in fact, we don't have those data. And I'll say something about what I expected each paper to be. And I recognize that Narasimha's paper, I don't have my head around the scope yet. And so it may not fit. So I don't have words. My problem is I think in pictures, but I'm a really bad artist. So you just have to put up with the brain dump, I'm afraid. And so there's so many different framings of well-being. And I also do not want to create a new framework, but I want to acknowledge that some of them look very different, but they have to be connected. Like we should all be talking about the same thing. And so I'm trying to use all the language and show how it connects. And so there's the ends right over here, and there's how you get there, which is the satisfiers. And so this is the progression that I'm seeing. And Narasimha has done work on this in his paper in 2017. He sent other papers showing people who have put together this sequence. But I'm starting to see, I think we usually talk about hedonic, which is more the sensory well-being, and the eudaimonic, which is like sort of fulfillment. I don't want to start a new framework, but I'm seeing things that are kind of in between the hedonic versus eudaimonic. So basically, and you can think of this as kind of an upside down Maslow's pyramid too. So basically, people are first trying to not die, right? And so your basic need is like life or health, but then that requires nutrition and shelter. And most of the indicators that you see are addressing these physiological needs, or many of them. And so sometimes people make indices out of people being deprived or happy or whatever, but a lot of them are just simply focused on your very basic physiological needs required to not die or not degrade. And the reason that I made these lines is when you look at the human needs frameworks of the capabilities of Nussbaum or Max Neef's list, there's a huge number in here relating to how you might feel fulfilled, and a very small number just relating to sort of basic functioning of the body. And yet these are what all the indicators, or many of the indicators, are focused around. And so I think this is one reason that the well-being communities are appear to be so disparate, because there's a group of people that are just simply focused on all the aspects of physiology, including the indoor well-being review that Allison shared by Hank. And then like down here, there's your belonging and self-esteem, and there's actually 3 tiers on Maslow's pyramid, and a number of capabilities are associated with this bucket, but they're not ones we talk about when we're trying to quantify well-being. So the thing I really want to include in Ellison's paper is she's talking about what people are measuring, and I don't want to reframe well-being, but I do want to show how indicators such as those developed and explored by Kartik relate to the overall framework of well-being. Like we're typically not getting at fulfillment, although that might be part of the response when people say whether they feel a sense of well-being. And there's this intermediate bucket that seems to me actually to be between hedonic and eudaimonic. And I'm really going to avoid trying to justify that in the paper, because we'll just start a war probably. But it's about like the freedom that you have to achieve your goals. So maybe there's a framing out there that includes it, but it has to do with security, or whether you're free, or whether you're productive. And so it's not this sense of fulfillment, but it's kind of broader than just your basic needs. And so because it's Maslow's second tier, I kind of put it in a second bucket. Anyway, this is far from complete. It's just something I'd like to see in Allison's paper, and I've been toying with ways to present it very simply, so that just so that you can see the different communities that discuss well-being. And then there's a whole bunch of like neuropsychology on how people respond to these things, and that could be a huge review too. So again, I'm not trying to write a whole new paper, only to provide a sense of how it might connect specifically for our project. I think that a framing like this could help. Ellison's making a list of the types of things that people have measured, where and it'll kind of show up where they fall in these different buckets. And then I think one thing that I struggle with is how to relate those factors to the types of things that Kartik is pulling out of the data. And I think that's a disconnect that we currently have that I'd like to see people talking about. So I'm going to stop there on this one.
Are you going to go to the next one?
Yep. So this is the secret longitudinal, right? And so this is how statistical representations usually work. You have some indicators, and those indicators are going to change in year n+5 or n+1 or whatever. And in year n, there's these are correlated with outcomes, and in the time step later, those indicators have changed and are correlated with outcomes. But really what happens is those indicators are more likely to be representing choice in some kind of adoption model that itself changes the technology stock. And so there's a dynamic component that's hidden in all this. Is why I'm calling it secret. And when I've probed Narasimha on this, he's like, yeah, but people don't really do that, right? It's either you have an ABM and you have a stock model, or you have a statistical model, but extracting the parameters for how the dynamic change works is not typically discussed. And so this seems to be an area that people are assuming will happen, and that that the statistical representation is it is surely accounting for this dynamic change, and change as a response, even though that's not ever checked. And my words on this are not very good right now, but it is a section that I would like to see in a paper that summarizes modeling approaches. And so you can say what the indicators are that are thought to influence adoption, and you can say how people assume interactions. And I've said, and I'll keep repeating, to me, it's all about the pace. What pace can you achieve, and what limits that pace or rate? And that is something that is not typically brought out. So this is a section that I would like to see in a paper about modeling approaches to adoption. Okay, I'm done.
Reactions?
I think what you shared, Tammy, is consistent with what I think is needed to get from what's in current studies to what I don't know how to say. yeah, I guess I'm really stuck on the idea of taxonomy. Like what's being measured in field-based studies is, as long as it checks the box of well-being, then it's considered roughly equivalent. And I think what an outcome could be based on the figure that you're describing would be that the things that people are measuring, we could see how they map onto that figure. And again, reveal like what's being represented, actually, what's not being represented. And that seems very, to me, useful.
Yeah, as far as your cross-sectional versus longitudinal, absolutely. 100% is going to be part of that discussion, which is what's going to lead to the idea of introducing this trigger and Christina's paper's work, or Christina's modeling work. It does bring up, though, about that being a separate paper of its own, actually, which I haven't discussed. But so I'm not concerned about that. The well-being part to me seems, yeah, it's very useful. But I feel it's so broad. I mean, I don't know if we need to think about limiting our view of what we want to look at in well-being, because it's so many dimensions to it. And especially if we're focusing only on the home, I mean, there's so many different aspects of life that affect people's well-being. So I don't know. It sounds, what you showed sounds very consistent but complementary to what Ellison described. It's like it could be its own paper and looking at the frameworks for conceptualizing well-being. But anyway, I think we are running out of time, so we have to figure out how to carry this discussion forward. I think Ellison's paper is a little bit separable in the sense I don't see any direct overlap. So I'd be really interested in that paper too. If I would love to be part of it in a small way if it's useful, but not necessarily. But I think I don't see the need for strong coordination between all of us, all that. I would definitely want to continue a discussion with Tammy and Raidul just to make clear as to what our products are and what we're doing, especially with Christina's work. I have more clarity than I gave indication of, I think partly because I did expect something different when you were talking about Raidul's potential paper that he would lead, but you were thinking of that as a model. I just want to make one statement about my work. So I think a good, clean way to distinguish them is Raidul is focused on an ABM, and I think whatever toy modeling I may want to do to illustrate points from the review would not be an ABM. So that's one clean way to divide them. And I'm perfectly happy for Raidul to contribute to the ABM component of the review. So that's also completely fine. I don't see a problem with that. So what I would suggest is that we have pretty quickly, we have follow-up meetings. Maybe next Tuesday, I guess, is the latest I would suggest we meet. For Raidul, Tammy, myself, and Zara, Karthik are welcome. Ellison too. And then separately, Ellison, you and Tammy decide how you want to proceed in terms of meeting on your paper and whether or not you want to include other people.
We've been
Sorry?
having writing. We've been having writing meetings on Ellison's paper.
Oh,
I
great.
see a small amount of overlap, but as you said, I don't see the need for deep integration. But I think the overlap is in beginning to think about aligning the decision variables, which may be planted in well-being. Right, like it'll be convenient if we're able to draw connections between why people make decisions or don't make decisions.
Yeah, I've seen one paper, literally one, I think, that does explicitly look at how comfort or perceived comfort influence the decision to change their heating equipment or the choice of heating equipment. Literally just one. It almost doesn't appear at all. So that's a gap that I think maybe should be emphasized in our review paper on the modeling stuff. But the linkage I would see is I would want to draw from Ellison's paper to make the case that it's important to include in modeling approaches.
Mhm.
From the modeling literature, it doesn't seem like there's enough empirical evidence to justify including it. It doesn't seem to be driving decisions, but that could be just an omission because it's not looking at the literature Ellison is looking at.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is that Ellison's focus on the residential environment combined with your focus on what's driving decisions. If there's a gap there, then we might it might be something to highlight.
I think that's also where I see, I don't think the people that are including well-being measures with people that they survey are doing so with people like you in mind. And they might be a bit more thoughtful in how they include things or how they describe what they include. That's where I think the taxonomy seems really useful, because I think there are people that would say to you, Narasimha, oh, people have been studying perceived thermal comfort for a long time and its role in decision making, and it's really well studied. But I, having looked at it a few times, and it's not really that well studied, but that's what people say they're studying.
And
We're
if
gonna ask a few questions about it, and yeah, sorry.
So if it would be actually useful to look at our reference lists, because another interesting gap may just be that the people involved in the one community are just not looking at relevant literature because of these disciplinary boundaries and silos. And that would be a super useful contribution from a project like ours to discover that, hey, we're not looking at a literature that we should be, that's looking at small case studies, field-based work where people are showing that comfort factors are really affecting their choices. And this other community is just not looking at those studies. So I think there is potential overlap where I would love to look at how your work is developing and see whether certain papers should be referenced in my paper. As look, you need to look at this. Maybe we need to think of new ways of expanding the scope to make it generalizable, but this is valid, important data, about field studies. So that's actually could be a super useful contribution that may, going back to the initial premise that I made, that there's no value in a new review paper, that could be value. But we're finding there's a whole bunch of papers that ought to be looked at that no one's looking at. I think one point of coordination would be, I would love it for us to very quickly develop, do this keyword search formally and come up with a list of papers that are going to be the basis of our writing.
Yep. Yeah, I
That
think
would be
that's
really
actually a goal I have for December 15th. I think I am on the schedule to present. And Zara and I just yesterday are going to launch our search. And I hadn't really wanted to encumber Zara in the presentation for December 15th. But I think my goal there would actually be to show what's turning up through the searches that we've done, or that at least I've done, and how I'm refining those search terms. And then like what is forming the evidence base for that paper.
Wow, that's great. I mean,
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Right.
No, I was gonna say, and then talk through decision. Like I don't think it's a useful thing to show, like, read through a list of 50 papers, but I'd rather like show, okay, these are the first 50 papers that have come back. Here's how related they are to what I thought we would find. And here's a few that serve as examples of things that I'm on the fence about inclusion versus exclusion of this kind of study. Can we talk about that as a group? So.
Okay. And I think I'm going to make it a goal for myself to do the same thing by December 15th. So and Raido, maybe you can help me. I think we already have the list, based on what you added last time. But let's just finalize that list of papers. I'll add them to my table, and then I'll send that to you all so that you know that what we are using as a literature base. And then before the new year, I'll try to look at your list of papers, Ellison, to figure out, is there something there to be said about an entire new literature that actually should be informing the modeling? That'll be really useful.
Okay.
Okay. So shall we say next Tuesday, same time, our modeling meeting, for us to continue this discussion about the modeling paper? Or do you want to meet
yeah.
earlier?
I think Tuesday's fine. Radul, you're moving faster than I am by a lot. So what do you think?
I'm fine. I'll fill out the table that Narsum has provided and include all of my extra references and update it accordingly so that we can move forward and have that discussion.
Okay, and I'll revise my conceptualization of the paper with the feedback from today to make it more clear and to make it consistent with what everything else is being done.
Yeah, and I think you've said many times there's not use in another review paper, but and yet we keep summarizing things. And so I think it might be clear to identify what and you've identified some of the things that are not known or that are biases, but clarifying what the review portion of the paper is doing, the gaps it is filling in.
Yeah. Okay, it's 11:15. Thank you. This is very useful. To be continued.
Yeah, thanks for getting us together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.